Still unemployed. The word hit harder than it should have, mostly because I'd heard it so many times that it no longer sounded like a question. It sounded like a verdict. I looked up from my plate as my uncle leaned back in his chair, smiling in that polite, pitying way people reserve for those they've already written off. The family dinner continued around us, clinking cutlery, low conversations, forced laughter. But the word unemployed echoed in my head like a label stamped permanently on my forehead. My mother avoided my eyes. My father cleared his throat, pretending to be busy with his phone. No one corrected him. I smiled thinly. I'm working on something. That was always my answer. Vague enough to avoid interrogation, honest enough not to be a lie. My cousin snorted softly. You've been working on something for 3 years. Laughter followed. Not cruel, just careless. The kind that assumes you won't amount to much anyway. I nodded, took a sip of water, and let it go. I had learned that defending yourself to people who enjoy misunderstanding you is a waste of energy. At home, things weren't much better. My parents loved me. I knew that. But love doesn't always come with understanding. To them, success had a clear shape, a job title, a salary slip, a predictable routine. What I had didn't fit any of those. You should apply somewhere stable, my father said one evening, not unkindly. Just until you figure things out. I have figured things out, I replied quietly. He sighed. Then why can't anyone see it? That was the question, wasn't it? Because what I was building couldn't be explained in dinner table sentences. Because it didn't come with immediate proof. Because I had chosen a path where results came late, but loud. I didn't say any of that. Instead, I went back to my room, opened my laptop, and returned to the work that no one believed in. The truth was, I wasn't unemployed. I just wasn't employed by anyone who could give me a business card. I was researching patterns, economic, social, technological. I was building a framework that connected systems people treated as separate. I was writing, revising, discarding, and starting again. Every day, some nights, doubt crept in. Not because I believed my family, but because isolation has a way of amplifying uncertainty. But every time I considered quitting, I reminded myself why I started. I wasn't chasing approval. I was chasing impact. The turning point came quietly, an email, no subject line. Just a short message from an editor I barely remembered contacting months earlier. We read your paper. We want to talk. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. The conversation that followed didn't feel real. Questions were asked, the kind that assumed competence, not desperation. They didn't ask why I wasn't employed. They asked why my ideas weren't already being used. Within weeks, my work was circulating in places my family had never heard of, and didn't need to. But I said nothing, not out of secrecy, out of self-preservation. At the next family gathering, nothing had changed. So, my aunt asked cheerfully, "Any job interviews?" "No," I said. She nodded sympathetically. "Don't worry. Your time will come." I smiled. It already had. They just didn't know it yet. Late that night, my phone buzzed. Another email. This one longer. Heavier. It ended with a sentence that made my hands tremble. "We believe your work has the potential to influence global discourse." I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. From unemployed, to unheard, to inevitable. And no on the first invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between spam emails and a reminder about an unpaid bill. If I hadn't been half awake, I might have deleted it without reading. It was from an organization whose name I recognized immediately. One of those institutions people referenced in serious conversations, not casual ones. They wanted me to present my work, not publish it quietly, not review it anonymously. Present it. I reread the email 3 times, making sure I hadn't misunderstood. Then I sat still for a long moment, letting the reality settle. This was the step I had been waiting for, the transition from solitary effort to public engagement. I told no one, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I had learned something important. Premature celebration invites premature judgment. I wasn't ready to defend my work to people who had already decided it wasn't real. The presentation happened in a modest conference room, not a grand hall. No cameras, no applause, just a long table, notebooks, and people who listened more than they spoke. They didn't ask about my employment history. They asked about assumptions. They challenged my logic, questioned my conclusions, and pushed my ideas harder than anyone ever had. I welcomed it. This was the scrutiny I respected, the kind that refines, not ridicules. By the end of the session, the room felt different, quieter, focused. One of them leaned back and said, "This changes how we think about the problem." I nodded, careful not to smile too much. At home, nothing changed. My mother still reminded me to eat properly. My father still asked if I'd heard back from anywhere. My relatives still spoke to me with that familiar mix of concern and condescension. I let them. I had stopped expecting them to see what I saw. Over the next few months, my work traveled faster than I did. Citations appeared. Conversations referenced ideas that had once lived only in my notebooks. I was invited into discussions I had never imagined being part of, not as an observer but as a contributor. I still didn't announce anything. The word unemployed still followed me into every family conversation. "You should really consider something stable," my cousin said one afternoon. "You're too smart to waste time like this." I smiled politely, smart enough apparently to endure being misunderstood. One evening I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. "I worry about him," my mother said quietly. "He doesn't talk about his future." "He doesn't have one," my father replied, not unkindly, but firmly. I stood in the hallway listening, feeling something tighten in my chest. Not anger, acceptance. They weren't cruel. They were just limited by what they could imagine. The next email came late at night. This one wasn't an invitation, it was a question. "Would you be open to expanding this work into a broader platform?" I replied within minutes, "Yes, always yes." The platform grew quickly, faster than I could have predicted. Collaborators joined, editors refined language, analysts tested assumptions. The work evolved, not into something different but something larger. Still, I said nothing. I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let results arrive unannounced. At a family wedding, I sat at the edge of the table while conversations buzzed around me. "So," someone said, "what do you do these days?" "I think," I replied honestly. They laughed. I didn't. A few weeks later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. "This is Time magazine," the voice said. I sat down slowly. "We've been following your work." The world tilted slightly. "We'd like to talk." That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, heart racing, not from excitement but from clarity. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. This was about outgrowing the need to be understood by people who never truly listened. At that dinner table had any idea what was coming. The first invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between spam emails and a reminder about an unpaid bill. If I hadn't been half awake, I might have deleted it without reading. It was for an organization whose name I recognized immediately. One of those institutions people referenced in serious conversations, not casual ones. They wanted me to present my work, not publish it quietly, not review it anonymously, present it. I reread the email 3 times, making sure I hadn't misunderstood. Then I sat still for a long moment, letting the reality settle. This was the step I had been waiting for, the transition from solitary effort to public engagement. I told no one, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I had learned something important. Premature celebration invites premature judgment. I wasn't ready to defend my work to people who had already decided it wasn't real. The presentation happened in a modest conference room, not a grand hall. No cameras, no applause, just a long table, notebooks, and people who listened more than they spoke. They didn't ask about my employment history. They asked about assumptions. They challenged my logic, questioned my conclusions, and pushed my ideas harder than anyone ever had. I welcomed it. This was the scrutiny I respected, the kind that refines, not ridicules. By the end of the session, the room felt different, quieter, focused. One of them leaned back and said, "This changes how we think about the problem." I nodded, careful not to smile too much. At home, nothing changed. My mother still reminded me to eat properly. My father still asked if I'd heard back from anywhere. My relatives still spoke to me with that familiar mix of concern and condescension. I let them. I had stopped expecting them to see what I saw. Over the next few months, my work traveled faster than I did. Citations appeared. Conversations referenced ideas that had once lived only in my notebooks. I was invited into discussions I had never imagined being part of, not as an observer, but as a contributor. I still didn't announce anything. The word unemployed still followed me into every family conversation. "You should really consider something stable," my cousin said one afternoon. "You're too smart to waste time like this." I smiled politely, smart enough apparently to endure being misunderstood. One evening I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. "I worry about him," my mother said quietly. "He doesn't talk about his future." "He doesn't have one," my father replied, not unkindly, but firmly. I stood in the hallway listening, feeling something tighten in my chest. Not anger, acceptance. They weren't cruel. They were just limited by what they could imagine. The next email came late at night. This one wasn't an invitation. It was a question. Would you be open to expanding this work into a broader platform? I replied within minutes, yes, always yes. The platform grew quickly, faster than I could have predicted. Collaborators joined. Editors refined language. Analysts tested assumptions. The work evolved, not into something different, but something larger. Still, I said nothing. I had learned that sometime, the most powerful thing you can do is let results arrive, unannounced. At a family wedding, I sat at the edge of the table while conversations buzzed around me. "So," someone said, "what do you do these days?" "I think," I replied honestly. They laughed. I didn't. A few weeks later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. "This is Time magazine," the voice said. I sat down slowly. "We've been following your work." The world tilted slightly. "We'd like to talk." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, heart racing. Not from excitement, but from clarity. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. This was about outgrowing the need to be understood by people who never truly listened. The call from Time didn't come with fireworks or dramatic promises. It was professional, measured, almost casual, like they weren't about to change the trajectory of my life. They asked about my work, about my motivations, about why I had stayed outside institutions for so long. They asked what failure meant to me, what silence had taught me, and whether I believed ideas could matter without authority behind them. I answered honestly. I didn't perform confidence. I didn't exaggerate struggle. I spoke the way I always had, carefully, deliberately, without asking for permission. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. Nothing had officially happened yet, but something irreversible had begun. At home, my life remained unchanged. My mother asked if I'd sent out resumes. My fath. Forwarded job listings just in case. Relatives continued their well-meaning concern. At dinner one night, my uncle said, "You know, at some point, passion has to pay bills." I nodded. "It does." He smiled indulgently. "Not yet." I didn't correct him, because the strange thing was, I no longer needed to. The interviews continued. not just with time but with editors, researchers, and advisors connected to institutions I had once only read about. They spoke to me as a peer. They disagreed with me thoughtfully. They challenged my assumptions without questioning my worth. It felt normal. This was the world I had been preparing for. I still told no one, not because I was afraid they'd doubt me, but because I wanted them to learn something without my help. I wanted them to see what happens when you assume too much for too long. The article draft arrived quietly in my inbox. No subject line hype, just a document. I read it slowly. They didn't call me a genius. They didn't frame me as a miracle. They told the story honestly, about years of obscurity, about unconventional paths, about how the most impactful work often comes from people who are invisible, by choice or circumstance. I closed the laptop and sat back. If this was the only recognition I ever received, it would have been enough. A week later, I attended a small professional gathering. No family, no friends, just people who knew my work. Someone asked, "How does it feel to finally be seen?" I thought for a moment. Stir. "Ange," I said, because I never felt invisible to myself. They nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. Meanwhile, at home, the tension grew. My parents began to sense something, not success, but distance. "You don't talk much anymore," my mother said one evening. "I never did," I replied gently. "You just notice it now." She frowned. "That's not fair." "It's honest," I said. She didn't argue. Then came the announcement. Not from me, from the world. A relative sent a message to the family group chat. "Is this you?" Attached was a link, Time magazine. My name, my face. For a moment, no one responded. Then the messages came, one after another. Confusion, shock, denial. My phone rang. It was my father. He didn't speak for several seconds. Finally, he said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I closed my eyes, "Because you had already decided who I was." Silence. Then quietly, "We were wrong." That evening, my parents sat across from me like strangers trying to relearn a familiar face. "We thought unemployed meant lost," my mother said. "It meant focused," I replied. My father nodded slowly. "We didn't know how to see that." "I didn't need you to," I said. "I needed you not to erase it." The article went live the next morning. By nightfall, everything changed. Messages from relatives turned apologetic. Friends resurfaced. Invitations appeared. I answered very few, not out of bitterness, out of boundaries. Later that night, my father knocked on my door. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not because of the article, because you didn't become resentful." I met his gaze. I came close. He nodded. I believe that, as I lay in bed, notifications still buzzing, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, peace. Because the title, Time's Person of the Year, was never the point. The point was surviving long enough for truth to arrive on its own. Once the article went live, the ripple effects were immediate. Emails flooded my inbox. Requests for interviews, panels, podcasts, and speaking engagements arrived faster than I could respond. Invitations to conferences I had never dreamed of attending piled up. People who had once dismissed me as the unemployed one were now clamoring to be associated with my work. At first, it was overwhelming. I had spent years in quiet preparation, building systems, testing ideas, refining concepts. Now the world was asking me to perform, not just for validation, but for influence. I reminded myself to breathe. Influence, I knew, was meaningless without integrity. Family dynamics shifted dramatically, almost overnight. Relatives who had laughed at my unemployment suddenly asked for meetings. Invitations to family gatherings included me in bold letters. My cousins, who had once made passing jokes about my wasted years, now whispered compliments I didn't entirely believe. An unexpected visitor appeared at my door one evening. My childhood friend, Ria. She had watched me work in silence, and now she had seen the world catch up to me. "You," I've always had it, she said, shaking her head in disbelief. I can't believe they're only noticing now. I smiled, though part of me wished they had seen it earlier. It doesn't matter who notices first, I replied. What matters is that it works. The media attention wasn't always flattering. Headlines exaggerated, reduced, and occasionally misrepresented my work. Some articles framed me as a miracle success, which was both thrilling and infuriating. I wasn't a miracle. I was persistent. I had been ignored, dismissed, and underestimated, and now I was finally being understood. One late night, I received an invitation to a televised panel discussion. The host began by saying, "Here's someone who went from being unemployed to Times Person of the Year. Let's hear how he did it." I allowed myself a small smile before correcting her tone. I wasn't unemployed. I was creating. There was silence. The audience shifted, the cameras rolled, and in that moment, I realized perception can lag behind reality, but it always catches up eventually. At home, the tension between visibility and family expectations became unavoidable. My parents were proud, finally, but it was layered with guilt. They apologized for doubting me. My mother cried one night, whispering, "I should have listened more." I reassured her, "It's okay, you didn't have all the information." My father remained stoic but sincere. "We underestimated patience," he admitted. "We underestimated your discipline." Even an Aya, who had once derided me for taking unconventional paths, approached me with tentative humility. "I didn't realize," she said softly. "I thought success was what we could see, titles, salaries, jobs. I see now I was wrong. I didn't lecture." I nodded. Recognition doesn't require explanation. The transformation went beyond family. Opportunities poured in. Governments requested consultancy. NGOs invited me to speak on sustainable projects. Private firms wanted insight into the frameworks I had developed. With each interaction, I realized something critical. Influence was no longer about personal validation. It was about action, about implementing change, about helping systems improve so people could benefit. I had once been invisible. Now I had a platform, and I intended to use it responsibly. The hardest adjustment was to maintain boundaries. People expected me to be available constantly. Invitations flooded in. Requests for interviews, for mentorship, for appearances became overwhelming. Some colleagues suggested I accept everything. I refused. "I won't sacrifice clarity for quantity," I told them. "My goal isn't fame, it's impact." They understood. Most didn't. But I had learned the difference between visibility and value. Months later, I received a formal letter from Time magazine. I had been nominated as Person of the Year officially. The news arrived quietly but carried enormous weight. I shared the announcement with my parents in person. Their reaction was a mix of disbelief and pride, tears and laughter. My mother hugged me like I had never left home. My father's voice trembled slightly as he said, "We didn't think it possible, and yet here we are." Anaya stayed quiet at first, then whispered, "I'm proud of you, truly." I smiled. "It's about more than pride, it's about understanding." She nodded, finally comprehending that the journey had always been bigger than appearances. Public recognition, however, wasn't the only consequence. It reshaped my identity. People I had met casually before treated me differently. Old friends who once ignored me now reached out for guidance. Professional networks expanded beyond imagination. I realized that being unemployed was never a failure. It had been a preparatory phase, a time to learn, to build, and to refine. What my family and the world initially dismissed as stagnation had been incubation. One evening, standing on my balcony, I looked at the city lights flickering below. The same city I had walked through unnoticed years ago, now hummed with attention, requests, and opportunities. And yet, I felt grounded. I wasn't changed by recognition. I was validated, but validation had never been my goal. My satisfaction came from seeing ideas move into action, from influencing policy, from seeing communities benefit from work I had quietly devoted myself to. For the first time, I felt entirely free from the old labels. That night, my mother whispered from the doorway, "You've taught us something, Imp." "Orton, what's that?" I asked. "That patience and belief matter more than appearances," she said, "and that sometimes the people who seem lost are simply preparing for something bigger." I nodded, quietly proud. The morning the official announcement hit, the world shifted for me overnight. Y-phone buzzed relentlessly. Notifications, emails, texts from friends, colleagues, journalists and organizations I had never expected to hear from. But the first call I received was from my mother. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, her voice trembling. Smiled quietly. "I have." Ears filled her eyes. We didn't believe it could happen." Laughed softly. "I didn't need you to." He paused. "But it matters to us, to see it, to finally understand what you've been doing all these years." "I'm glad you do," I said. "But the important part is what happens next." The ceremony where Time recognized me as Person of the Year was formal but intimate. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. Journalists, influencers, and leaders gathered, all waiting to hear a story they assumed would be about overnight success. Tea wasn't hen. I stepped onto the stage to accept the recognition. I didn't talk about luck. I didn't talk about connections. I talked about years of quiet work, about unseen effort, about being patient when no one noticed. I spoke about failures as stepping stones, about learning to trust process over applause. The applause that followed was deafening, not because they just realized who I was, but because my words resonated. Every single person there understood that achievement isn't always obvious until it arrives fully formed. Back home, my family watched the televised coverage. For once, my parents weren't just proud, they were awestruck. My father leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slowly. "We underestimated you completely." My mother wiped tears from her eyes. "I don't even know how to feel." I walked over, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "Feel what you want. I've been living my own truth all along." Anaya approached quietly. She had watched from a distance, uncertain where she fit in this sudden recognition. I see now," she whispered. "I was wrong to dismiss you. Wrong to think success could be measured the way I measured it." "You're learning," I said softly. "That's enough for me." The world had shifted, and so had I. Invitations to speak, to consult, and to advise poured in daily. But with recognition came responsibility. I realized that being Person of the Year wasn't about fame. It was about influence, about using this platform to make meaningful change. I had always believed that ideas mattered more than recognition. Now I had the chance to ensure that belief had tangible results. I accepted interviews carefully, choosing opportunities that aligned with my vision. I met with policymakers and thought leaders, shaping programs that could change communities and influence industries. Each time I saw a tangible impact, I remembered the long nights of unseen work, the patience that no one at home had understood. Even family gatherings changed. Relatives who once whispered judgment now listened attentively, asking for advice, asking how they could contribute. My parents no longer worried about job stability or future prospects. Instead, they asked questions about implementation, about strategy, about real-world impact. I smiled quietly to myself. Recognition was finally irrelevant. They were now seeing the reality. One evening, I received a private message from a journalist who had covered the announcement. "Your story is inspiring. Can we talk about how you stayed focused despite being dismissed?" I wrote back simply, "Focus is louder than validation." They published it. Messages poured in from students, young professionals, and others who had been underestimated or dismissed. I realized something profound. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a beacon for anyone who had been ignored. For the first time, I saw the real impact of patience and persistence. Months passed, and awards, recognitions, and invitations continued. But at home, life remained grounded. My family no longer measured success in superficial ways. They had learned from my example. Anaya approached me one afternoon, carrying a folder of her own professional work. "I want your advice," she said. "I want to learn how to navigate this responsibly, not just chase appearances." I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt complete satisfaction. "Then we start now," I said. Standing on the balcony that evening, city lights stretching endlessly below, I reflected on the journey. From the word unemployed echoing in every family conversation, to anonymous emails and overlooked ideas, to global recognition as Person of the Year. It wasn't the award, the headlines, or the title that mattered. It was the journey, quiet, deliberate, and unstoppable. I finally understood that success isn't about being noticed. It's about being consistent when no one is watching, about building value when it's invisible, about trusting your path even when others doubt it. And when my family finally understood, when my parents finally believed, and when my sister finally acknowledged her misjudgment, I realized something important. Validation is fleeting, but integrity, patience, and persistence endure. The next day, I walked into the office of a new initiative I was launching, greeted by collaborators who had become partners in change. Together, we would implement programs inspired by years of overlooked work, unseen research, and patient effort. A message from my mother arrived later that evening. "We're proud of you, not just for the recognition, but for how you earned it. You've shown us all what perseverance really looks like." I smiled, because after all these years, being seen was no longer the goal. Being effective, impactful, and true to myself had always been the point. From unemployed to Times Person of the Year, my life had changed dramatically, but my principles had not. And that, I realized, was the real victory. They saw what I had always known. More stories will keep coming, so please don't forget to like and subscribe.